¿Hacemos más o qué? ¿Ya estamos? Vale. Vale. Esto no me lo puedo beber, ¿eh? ¿Ah, sí? ¿Es bueno? Vale. Bueno. Hola, buenas tardes. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos y bienvenides. Y bueno, la verdad es que como siempre es realmente emocionante para mí, la verdad, cada vez que organizamos algo, poder encontrarme con vosotros, que ya sois realmente un contrapúblico, una contraesfera pública, que no sé dónde estáis, pero que de repente os acabáis reuniendo aquí y siempre incluso más de lo que uno podría imaginar. Así que bueno, os doy una gran bienvenida y me alegra muchísimo ver a caras de gente que ya conozco y que admiro, que están en el público, y a otra gente nueva que se va sumando a esta contrasfera. Bueno, os voy a contar, voy a intentar ceñirme al pequeño texto que había escrito de presentación, sobre todo para no dejarme llevar por la emoción de estar aquí con vosotros, que ya sabéis, fundamentalmente cuando yo me encuentro en una asamblea de este tipo, ya, aquellos que me conocéis ya lo sabéis, en realidad lo que yo querría es fundamentalmente hacer la revolución con vosotros, ¿no? Con lo cual, entre tanto, me cuesta bastante como hacer cualquier otra cosa que no sea eso, así que me voy a ceñir a leer el pequeño texto de presentación para que veáis de dónde surge la idea de este seminario que vamos a hacer hoy y mañana. Y os contaré también quiénes serán nuestros extraordinarios invitados que tenemos aquí hoy con nosotros, invitados e invitadas, como veis, y lo que vamos a hacer también mañana, quizás. Bueno, ya veis que este seminario, que tiene un nombre un tanto extraño, se llama Campceptualismos del sur y Tropicamp, políticas performativas y subalternidad. Y ya sabéis que hace unos años que casi más empujados por los participantes y los alumnos del programa de estudios independientes, que en la mayoría de los casos, o en muchos de los casos, provienen de América Latina y nos van arrastrando cada vez de manera más fuerte hacia los movimientos, las políticas y los lenguajes del sur. Y yo creo que ya hemos entrado todos aquí en el PEI. Bueno, no sé si más rápido o menos rápido, pero ya estamos entrando en un proceso de descolonización de los lenguajes nacionales que estábamos manejando hasta hace poco, incluso fijaos, en las propias retóricas gays, lesbianas, transgénero, transexuales y queer. Bueno, así que la idea de este seminario era precisamente, fijaos, ya no hacer una historia, ni una historia feminista, ni una historia de las prácticas gays o lesbianas, porque os daréis cuenta, aquellos que conocéis mi trabajo y que quizá nos hemos encontrado en otras ocasiones, bueno, algunos de nosotros nos formamos en Estados Unidos, ese fue mi caso. Yo me fui muy pronto a Estados Unidos y prácticamente toda mi educación, tanto política, de activista, como mi educación teórica, como los lenguajes que yo practiqué en Estados Unidos, tenían que ver con la genealogía norteamericana. Y bueno, luego intentábamos, por ejemplo, cuando yo llegué al contexto del Estado español, y más en concreto a Barcelona, realmente yo no conocía, de verdad, os tengo que decir y confesar, yo no conocía las políticas gays, lesbianas, transexuales, transgénero locales. Conocía mejor la historiografía americana que la historia local. Así que desde hace unos años, ya con un primer grupo de alumnos y de participantes del programa de estudios independientes, algunos de los cuales están aquí, y ya os contaré después, empezamos a trabajar en un proyecto de investigación que se llamaba Peligrosidad Social y que intentaba investigar algunas de las prácticas de resistencia y disidencia de género y sexual que habían emergido durante la dictadura y que posiblemente necesitaban ser pensadas con otra temporalidad, con otras genealogías y con otras categorías que no eran las de la genealogía norteamericana. Así que esa era un poco, fijaos, la sacudida la sacudida conceptual en la que empezamos a movernos, algunos de nosotros, ya os digo, casi de manera más frágil, puesto que tampoco era la cultura política que conocíamos, pero yo creo que ese encuentro y ese proceso crítico ha sido muy, muy fructífero. Así que desde ahí lo que nos planteamos es cuestionar, fijaos, la historiografía feminista, gay, lesbiana y queer anglosajona. Es decir, por qué hemos estado pensando nuestras propias prácticas políticas locales, los lenguajes de la resistencia, de la disidencia locales, con conceptos y con gramáticas fundamentalmente anglosajones. Por tanto, se trataba de revisar también esos conceptos centrales, esas temporalidades, confrontándolos con la producción micropolítica del sur, de los contextos dictatoriales, postdictatoriales y poscoloniales, desde tanto América Latina como, evidentemente, el Estado español. Aquí os dais cuenta, cuando hablamos de los campceptualismos del sur, el sur no es un simple emplazamiento geográfico, se trata de una contratopía que permite deconstruir los saberes y las prácticas capitalistas, permite, ya sabéis, cuando digo contrautopía os imagináis que permite, en el mejor de los casos, es decir, se trataría de una ficción deseante de poder, fijaos, poder de construir los saberes y las prácticas capitalistas y coloniales del norte. Por tanto, al mismo tiempo vamos a tratar de dar cuenta del paso de las estéticas, de lo que se llamó durante mucho tiempo, a partir al menos de los años 60, las estéticas camp y las políticas queer, a una multiplicidad de prácticas de disidencia de género y de guerrilla sexual, típicamente descoloniales y posidentitarias, que ponen en cuestión las técnicas hegemónicas de producción de la diferencia sexual y sus instituciones de reproducción cultural. Algunas de las cuestiones que vamos a abordar aquí son qué sucede, por ejemplo, con la historiografía dominante cuando se confronta con las prácticas estéticas y políticas de oitícica, es algo que haremos con Max Jorge, que está aquí con nosotros, luego os contaré, de las yeguas del Apocalipsis, por ejemplo, en Chile, de Ocaña, de Camilo, de Nazario, de Alejandro, y algunos de vosotros conocéis algunas de estas figuras, incluso de primera mano, de Pau Riba, de Onliyú, de María la Virgen de las Ramblas, de Violeta la Burra, de Quique, de Xefo, de las travestis de las cuevas, de Carlos Mir, de Les Ancucas, de los hermanos Farriol, de las Bocas, la Weekend, la Torbellino. Es decir, qué va a ocurrir con, fijaos, con esa genealogía de las prácticas y las políticas y las estéticas queer y camp cuando la vamos a confrontar con estas figuras, en principio, sureñas, periféricas, relativamente exóticas, fijaos, para esa genealogía anglosajona. ¿Qué hacer con los maricas y las bolleras del flamenco? ¿Dónde vamos a meter a los maricas y las bolleras del flamenco? ¿Y cómo los vamos a pensar? ¿Cómo integra el folclore nacional, en este caso me refiero al nacional español, el travestismo, por ejemplo, de Trinidad la Cuenca? ¿Cómo se relacionan los iconos de la cultura hegemónica del nacionalcatolicismo y del lumpen sexopolítico? ¿En qué consiste, y si es posible pensarlo como una práctica de resistencia, esa práctica que la artista cubano-americana Camelita Tropicana denominaba choteo? ¿Dónde quedan las locas y los marimachos del marxismo? ¿Por qué el marxismo no ha sido capaz de pensar ni sus locas ni sus marimachos? ¿Y qué ocurre con las lógicas de izquierda cuando las confrontamos con prácticas de disidencia de género y sexual? ¿Qué ocurre con Warhol si lo leemos desde el sur? ¿Cómo vamos a descolonizar el feminismo de libre mercado y las políticas gays neoliberales? Ahora me encontraba con alguien que estaba en esta conferencia que me decía que había otra conferencia en la Bon Maison sobre feminismo, ¿no? Algo así como si hubiera que elegir entre las políticas queers y las políticas feministas. Bueno, no sé, aquellos que sepáis algo de lo que está sucediendo, a mí me parece que aquí vamos a hablar fundamentalmente de lo que es el feminismo hoy, de lo que está produciendo teóricamente el feminismo. Ya veis, ese amplio terreno de lucha y de confrontación que llamamos ahora transfeminismo y que por tanto está muy próximo con algunas de las prácticas de disidencia de género y sexual de las que vamos a hablar aquí. Digo esto para los que tengan que elegir entre el feminismo y las prácticas queer, que sepan que esa elección es falsa, chicos, estáis en el buen sitio. Intuyendo la heterogeneidad sexopolítica del sur, el artista brasileño del que nos hablará Max Jorge, Elio Oitícica, inventa en el 71 el término absolutamente increíble tropicamp, ¿no?, para caracterizar la resistencia del sur a la comercialización de las estéticas maricas en Estados Unidos. Lo mismo va a ocurrir en parte con el andaluz Pepe Ocaña cuando tanto frente a las drag queen de Nueva York como a lo que él llama las intelectualas, y dicho sea de paso, seguramente si Ocaña estuviera aquí y está, ya veis, a través de una de sus beatas, seguramente Ocaña estaría diciendo, pero ¿qué hacen todas estas intelectualas, ¿no? Bueno, pues que las intelectualas están de vuelta y se han pasado al campo de Ocaña, ¿no? Esto es lo que nos ha ocurrido. Pero bueno, Ocaña en su momento, fijaos, va a criticar tanto a las drag queens de Nueva York como a las intelectualas catalanas, como a los marxistas ortodoxos, y se va a afirmar gitana y libertaria. ¿Qué sería hoy, fijaos, qué sería hoy en términos políticos afirmar una política y una estética gitana y libertaria? Situadas en distancia crítica con respecto al capitalismo y a la colonización, las prácticas de resistencia y subversión de género del sur exceden y desplazan las oposiciones historiográficas entre lo que Ocaña llamaba el arte conceptual, que fijaos, de ahí en parte surge este conceptualismo, ¿no? de esta resistencia de Ocaña a pensarse como conceptual, y esa resistencia del conceptualismo a poder incluir las prácticas de Ocaña dentro de lo que eran todo un conjunto de prácticas en parte muy próximas a lo que Ocaña estaba haciendo. Por tanto, os digo, fijaos, este conjunto de prácticas de crítica de género y de la sexualidad me da la impresión que exceden los marcos y las oposiciones clásicas de la historiografía del arte, como arte conceptual y performance, kitsch y camp, pop y posmodernidad. Se trata aquí, por tanto, de complejizar y de problematizar las posibles relaciones entre la despolitizada noción de la estética camp, como ya sabéis, popularizada internacionalmente por Susan Sontag en 1963, cuando ella escribe ese texto que de alguna manera va a generar toda una inflexión discursiva más adelante, que es este texto que se llama Notes on Camp, Notas sobre lo camp, y del que iremos hablando en distintos momentos todos nosotros, ¿no? para acabar de arrancarle el cuello a Susan Sontag con su idea de lo camp y para llevarla a los vertederos del sur, donde seguramente no espero encontrarse. Bueno, pues las prácticas conceptuales y las micropolíticas de género y sexuales que surgen de estos conceptos, de estos contextos dictatoriales y postdictatoriales, me da la impresión que exceden, fijaos, esas nociones historiográficas tradicionales con las que hasta ahora se ha estado pensando no solamente el pop, el posmodernismo, el arte conceptual, sino se ha estado pensando también la historia de los movimientos gays y lesbianos. Por tanto, se trata también de extraer esa historia de los movimientos, que es la nuestra, de extraerla de una genealogía fundamentalmente neoliberal, capitalista y colonial. Claro, dicho esto, fijaos, el proyecto, por tanto, utópicamente nos presentamos como muy envalentonados, pero habrá que darse cuenta de la posición más o menos modesta en la que podemos estar frente a las aspiraciones ingentes que tenemos aquí fijaos, de echar esa historiografía abajo, ¿no? Por tanto, es decir, una de las cosas que me alegran de ver que sois numerosísimos es que esta tarea de lectura contrahistoriográfica es una tarea ingente, que lo que vamos a hacer nosotros aquí hoy es casi como sacar unas plumillas ahí al aire, ¿no? Y que aquí hará falta una gran batalla, ¿no? Estas narrativas aparentemente menores y periféricas destabilizan, por tanto, el marco neoliberal en el que se leen las políticas queer. Las prácticas de desobediencia performativa del sur cuestionan la supuesta despolitización del camp y reclaman otro relato anticapitalista, libertario, descolonial, anarquista, revolucionario, etc. Ya veremos en qué medida cada uno de esos marcos puede ser pertinente como estrategia para pensar la práctica política y la acción estética hoy. Por tanto, habrá que definir nuevos lenguajes, y de ahí la tarea, fijaos, de recuperar el tropicamp, de intentar recuperar el campceptualismo, de hablar de los tablaos degenerados o del camp punk, o de, bueno, ya veremos qué es lo que nos cuenta Aymar sobre el punk y qué hacemos con el punk aquí, cómo lo metemos dentro de toda esta ensalada, este gazpacho, por decirlo con Ocaña, que estamos montando aquí, de prácticas de resistencia, ¿no? Y por tanto, es decir, se tratará de inventar nuevos lenguajes, de trazar nuevas genealogías y, en último término, de reclamar una historiografía capaz de dar cuenta de los procesos de agenciamiento político que se sitúan en contrapunto con respecto a la epistemología colonial y a la narración de liberación sexual y de género hegemónica que hasta ahora ha dominado la representación visual y las prácticas artísticas tanto en los estudios feministas como en los estudios gays y lesbianos. Bueno, así que tremendo proyecto en el que nos embarcamos, suerte de contar con algunas voces que nos puedan ayudar en esta tarea, fijaros, de descolonización de las historiografías dominantes. Y sin deciros más, querría presentaros al primero de los conferenciantes de esta tarde, o la primera de las conferenciantes de esta tarde. No asumiré en este caso, ya veis a ver, no voy a asumir ni género ni sexo de ninguno de los conferenciantes y de las conferenciantes. Así que la primera de las conferenciantes de esta tarde será Marc Siegel. Es profesora de Teoría de Cine en la Universidad Goethe de Fráncfort. Su investigación se centra en el cine de vanguardia y los estudios queer, y actualmente trabaja en 2 libros, uno sobre la superestrella drag del underground americano Mario Montes, de la que también nos hablará hoy, y otro sobre el director alemán Ludwig Schoenberg. Como comisario, sus proyectos incluyen un proyecto muy importante que realizó en el 2012 que se llama Camp y Anticamp, y que de alguna manera fue un punto de diálogo y de conversación para nosotros, a partir del cual también empezamos a pensar en la posibilidad de montar esta sesión de trabajo de hoy. Y ha sido también comisario de varias exposiciones sobre Jack Smith, y conferenciante, me dice casi ya, se siente casi como la encarnación, casi un poco como lo que le ocurre a la Beata de Ocaña, ¿no? Pues a él le pasa lo mismo con Jack Smith, está poseído por Jack Smith, y de alguna manera ha sido un poco el heredero de la filmografía y los proyectos curatoriales que se han venido realizando últimamente sobre Jack Smith. Bueno, hoy nos hablará precisamente sobre Jack Smith. El título de su conferencia era difícil de traducir. En principio era Believe in Jack Smith, y él nos contará por qué, bueno, lo hemos traducido como Creer en Jack Smith, y ya os contará él las complejidades de la traducción de ese título. Así que os dejo con Marc Siegel y os pido un fuerte aplauso para ella.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Muchas gracias, Beatriz. I apologize in advance for not being able to speak Spanish or Catalan, and but I also muchas gracias por escuchar en inglés. I don't know if you can listen in English, but to listen to me. But it's a great pleasure for me to be here. I've long admired Beatriz's work, and it's was wonderful to get this invitation. But thank you also to Miriam and Marichel who arranged everything for my visit.
Maybe going down to watch your images, right?
Oh,
maybe. Yes, yeah.
If you like, I have nice company.
Maybe.
What I'd like to do today, I'll sit over here. Wait, let me do this. Oh, yeah. What I'd like to do today is present work from a book I'm currently working on that's dealing with the role of gossip in queer film culture. The book, A Gossip of Images, Hollywood Star Images and Queer Counterpublics, is an attempt to theorize the dynamic process of speculating about and embellishing Hollywood star images in queer counterpublics as a form of gossip. To make this argument, I analyze select examples of films, videos, performances, and criticism, as well as the incidental remark at an interview or in an interview or at a conference. Gossip, it is argued, is not simply a means of oral communication, but is a speculative logic of thought, apposite to cinema and central to the construction of identity and intimacy in queer counterpublics. Following the work of literary scholars Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick and Patricia Meyer-Spax, I treat gossip as a performative means of transforming one's relationship to the self and one's intimates through the circulation of speculations about others. Moreover, I take seriously the etymological link of the word speculation to the Latin specula, meaning lookout or watchtower, and speciere, meaning to see or to look. so as to emphasize the possibilities visualized through the intimate exchange of conjecture about others. I suggest that the speculative function of gossip is to enhance, embellish, and expand images of others, be they personal acquaintances or Hollywood stars, so as to generate unique images that are gossip's own. Hence, my decision to coin the term gossip image. Although the book certainly has historical implications, its main concern is in providing a theorization of gossip as a mode of image circulation, so as to clarify the productivity of a queer investment in Hollywood star images, and hopefully other images. My examples from the history of predominantly US American queer filmmaking and film criticism focus roughly on the period dating from the underground film movement in the 1960s through the birth of the so-called new queer cinema in the 1990s. And I've organized the book according to different aspects of a theory of gossip: circulation, belief, details, and fabulation. The third chapter of this book, titled Lensable Belief, or a belief that can be captured by a camera lens, focuses on pioneering American underground artist Jack Smith, who died due to complications related to AIDS in 1989. And it focuses on the queer underground scene in New York in the 1960s. And it makes the argument that gossip's privileging of belief over knowledge can be exemplified through Smith's obsessions with 1940s Hollywood actress and star of escapist fantasy films, Maria Montez. Hay una retrospectiva dans la Cinémathèque Española en Madrid en November de Maria Montez. Given the context of this conference, it's perhaps important to clarify a few things. First, I don't intend to posit gossip as a replacement for camp when approaching queer cultural practices. The focus on gossip has simply allowed me to highlight aspects of queer engagements with popular culture, Hollywood star images foremost among them in my case. That to my mind, these engagements with popular culture, to my mind, have been inadequately described, and in many cases, inadequately described as camp. So my project, and hopefully the part of it I present here, links up with the conference theme by trying to provide a historically grounded, theoretical perspective on specific queer cultural practices, a perspective that attempts to return to these practices a productivity that camp descriptions have stripped from them. Second, my focus here is obviously on US American culture. That said, Jack Smith's work and life, and here is an image from one of his films, is permeated by Latin American imagery, maybe not in this image, or fantasies about Latin America as inspired by 30s and 40s Hollywood films and pop music. As far as I know, he only traveled once to Latin America, namely to the Carnival in Rio in 1966, where he shot footage that he incorporated into a film fragment that today goes under the name of Respectable Creatures. This is from a different part of that film. The films of Dominican-born actress Maria Montez provided the lens with which Smith reimagined not only norms governing gender, sexual, racial, and ethnic representation, but also economic, social, and artistic relations under capitalism. He once pleaded, "Oh, Maria Montez, give socialist answers to a rented world." Moreover, an interest in Latin Americans and Latin American culture seemed to motivate and drive Smith's investment in the exotic and in exotica. In Smith's idiosyncratic vocabulary, the word exotic was reserved for the highest form of compliment, referring at once to the fascinating, the productive, the artistic, and the ethical. One of his business cards read, Jack Smith, exotic consultant. Anything from ancient Egypt to the 1940s. And Smith's art historiography stopped in 1940s Hollywood. In a forthcoming article entitled Jack Smith, Eleoichisica, Tropicalism, Juan Suarez de Murcia, notes that the exotic, however vague and undifferentiated, quote, touches every aspect of Smith's production and may therefore be discussed from many other angles, style, ideology, praxis, materials, or sexuality. Suarez continues, the fact remains that for all their indefiniteness, Smith's affiliations with exotica tended to pass through Latino cultures, dimly perceived through a web of cliché, but still sincerely valued and knowingly deployed as signifiers of radical difference, end quote. It was precisely Smith and his great drag superstar Mario Montez's radical deployment of exotica, what Suarez calls Smith's tropicalism, that so excited Brazilian artist Eleoichisica, as will be discussed by Max Jorge later, I imagine. The fact that Mario, like Maria Montez, was Caribbean himself. Mario was born as René Rivera in Puerto Rico, fueled Smith's tropicalism and inspired Oichisica's Tropicamp. Finally, a focus on Smith's work, particularly on his influential fascination for Maria Montez, might help us complicate some of the assumptions about queer culture that have been inherited from Susan Sontag's misreading of what she, in 1964, termed camp. 2 years before the appearance of both Notes on Camp and that essay's companion piece, Sontag's defense of Jack Smith's film Flaming Creatures, called On Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures, Jack Smith himself published a brilliant essay, The Perfect Filmic Appositeness of Maria Montez, a piece which proves, contra Sontag, that one who wholeheartedly shares in a given sensibility can, of course, analyze it. Smith's interest in Montez, in both Montezes, perhaps, Maria and Mario, therefore provides a useful starting point, I think, for decolonizing camp historiography. And I'd like now to start with a quote from writer Ronald Tavel, who was not only Jack Smith's friend and collaborator, but also the screenwriter for many Andy Warhol films and the co-founder of the queer theater movement, the Theater of the Ridiculous. Tavel wrote, I have a little translation, Espero que esté claro que camp y Jack Smith son dos cosas aparte. Incluso usando materiales propios del camp, Smith está en el polo opuesto. Él es todo creencia. In recent interviews, John Vaccaro, the New York underground actor and the other co-founder with Tavel of the groundbreaking queer Theater of the Ridiculous movement, recalls an exchange between Andy Warhol and Jack Smith that, to Vaccaro's mind, goes to the heart of what's missing from contemporary scholarship on these two seminal artists. So Vaccaro remembers hearing Warhol tell Smith, Jack, you're MGM, and I'm just Warner Brothers. He offers no further elaboration on what exactly this witty confession is meant to add to current scholarship. Thus, scholars interested in the self-conception and interpersonal relationships of these 60s underground artists are left alone to speculate about the possible resonances of this bit of hearsay. Such speculations could, of course, lead in many different directions. Allow me to venture some possibilities. Does Vaccaro, for example, want to draw attention to Warhol's perhaps paradoxical, although touching, concession that Smith had a bigger, more glamorous studio than he did? MGM was, of course, known in its golden age in Hollywood to feature more stars than there are in heaven. Indeed, many Warhol superstars and collaborators got their start in Smith's Cinema Rock Studios, the name the artist used to link together his film, photography, and art production. Warhol even acknowledged that he took the term superstar from Smith. That said, the question remains, why would Warhol link Smith with MGM and himself with just Warner Brothers? One could easily see the comparison go in the other direction. Warner Brothers was, after all, the home to Smith's beloved Busby Berkeley, whose 30s choreographic spectacles were far more important to Smith's aesthetic ambitions than the slick production values associated with MGM. Much of Smith's photography and his film Normal Love from 1963 do, however, display a facility with stunning color composition that rivals the best of MGM's Technicolor features. Yes, and you could see some of the color in this beautiful image. For his part, Warhol was known, if not to love Warner Brothers gangster films, then at least to manifest in his own films a variant of their gritty realism. Now, as this preliminary set of speculations suggests, Vaccaro's juicy bit of hearsay resonates with enough received information about Warhol and Smith to generate productive reflection on their work and mutual influence. However tempting as it is to further this speculative research, I am less interested in the legitimacy of the comparison that Vaccaro mentions than in the mere fact that his repetition of it and his emphasis of its importance implies that the relationship between these two seminal figures in 1960s American underground arts might be understood through reference to Hollywood. Moreover, this claim, like so many others we hear about Smith and Warhol, is passed on to us today in the form of hearsay or gossip. John Vaccaro said that Andy Warhol said to Jack Smith, ... That Smith, Warhol, and others in the American underground developed their work in conversation with Hollywood, however, is in fact not missing from recent scholarship on either artist. What is missing, I would argue, is a deeper consideration of the dynamics of this intimate and indiscreet conversation. A conversation that, echoing Vaccaro's revelation of Warhol's Hollywood comparison, took the form of gossip. So their conversation with Hollywood took the form of gossip, I would say. Suggesting that the American underground stands in a gossipy relationship to Hollywood enables a consideration not simply of the interests Warhol, Smith, Vaccaro, Kenneth Anger, and Ronald Tavel had in the star scandals and behind-the-scenes transgressions in Tinseltown. Having grown up during its golden age, these artists' conception of film and image making was so strongly determined by Hollywood, be it the films of Shirley Temple, Hedy Lamarr, or Maria Montez, that it almost goes without saying that they, as diligent fans, would be interested as well in studio publicity and gossip about their beloved movie stars. Moreover, coming to terms with their homosexuality in the midst of an extremely homophobic era in the United States, these artists found something in the Hollywood films and star images they loved that provided a much-needed sense of possibility at a time when the world around them seemed unlikely to afford their gender and sexual difference its place. Scholar Michael Moon asks, for instance, I don't know why that's crooked, but it's okay. Scholar Michael Moon asks, and I quote, "For how many gay men of my own and the previous generation were our earliest intimations that there might be a gap between our received gender identity and our subjective or felt one, the consequence not of noticing our own erotic attraction to another boy or man, but of enthusiastically enjoying and identifying with the performative excesses of Maria Montez rather than John Hall, or Lana Turner rather than Burt Lancaster, or Jane Mansfield rather than Mickey Hargitay." End quote. Although underscoring the reciprocal relationship between film viewing and the pursuit of non-normative erotic desire that I argue is central to the mobility of star images in queer counterpublics, Moon's words draw attention to the significance of male cross-identification with the performances of excessive femininity by 40s and 50s Hollywood screen goddesses. Indeed, which came first, loving Maria Montez or loving another man? His analysis hinges primarily on the enthusiasm of gay male fans for Maria Montez's star image, an enthusiasm they shared significantly with the star herself. Montez's famous and among queers most quoted comment remains, "When I see myself on the screen, I look so beautiful, I want to scream with joy." The fact that accounts of Montez's emphatic embrace of her own beautiful screen image circulated frequently and fondly among gay men leads Moon to postulate gay male fandom as a mode not simply of emphatically embracing someone else's beautiful screen image, but of looking at that screen image as if it were a mirror image. That is, of utilizing star images to reconceive one's self-image. As Moon puts it, quote, "Not the least of the cultural constructs shattered by the impulse to scream with joy at the adorable self-image on the movie screen on the part of the male fans of Montez or Lana Turner or Jane Mansfield is their masculine gender identity." End quote. The gap between one's received gender and sexual identity and one's self-understanding came to be mediated through Hollywood images. And in this respect, I think it's perhaps relevant to note that Judith Butler recently suggested on French television that her theory of gender in Gender Trouble might have derived from her observations of how her immigrant American Jewish parents and grandparents attempted to embody or approximate the exaggerated gender performances of Hollywood stars like Joan Crawford and Clark Gable. And this failure at embodying these images of gender performance from elsewhere is what led Butler to think more seriously about gender trouble. Through sharing accounts of Montez's joyful self-recognition among trusted others, queers were able to construct a kind of counter-public self-awareness out of such an enthusiastic love for Hollywood star images. Hence, they were not solely interested in Hollywood gossip, but in utilizing Hollywood star images as the object of their own gossip, so as to facilitate the so-called criminal intimacies of 1950s and 60s queer life. Indeed, we might say that the lurid tales of the stars' sexual, emotional, and gender transgressions, along with the escapist fantasy images of Hollywood films, provided these members of the movies generation with what Gilles Deleuze, in an only slightly different context, calls reasons to believe in this world. It may seem almost counterintuitive to claim that the escapist technicolor illusions of Montez's films provided underground artists such as Smith, Warhol, and Tavel with reasons to believe in this world and not in another, alternative one. But I would argue that for Smith, in particular, the lure of Montez's fantasy images was not simply that he might leave the drab, homophobic world as he knew it for a lush fantasy creation far removed from his daily life. Indeed, Montez's screen image made evident to Smith her belief in the transformative power of performing fantasy roles for the camera and of forging cinematic worlds. And as Smith once remarked to Tavel, what worked for her could work for you. For Smith, Montezland, which was how he described the world of her films, was not just something reserved for Hollywood studios, but was a very real possibility on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and in his own apartment as well. Indeed, a closer look at Smith and Tavel's Montez worship, and by extension, the broader underground film movement's idiosyncratic investment in Hollywood, reveals some of the most committed attempts at heeding what Deleuze argues is the task of a post-war modern cinema: to restore belief in the connection between man and the world. Deleuze writes, and here I quote from his cinema books, Cinema 2, "The link between man and the world is broken. Henceforth, this link must become an object of belief. It is the impossible, which can only be restored within a faith. Only belief in the world can reconnect man to what he sees and hears. The cinema must film not the world, but belief in this world, our only link. Restoring our belief in the world, this is the power of modern cinema when it stops being bad. Whether we are Christians or atheists, in our universal schizophrenia, we need reasons to believe in this world." End quote. Deleuze specifically had in mind post-war European cinema and the real crisis it confronted of destroyed cities, broken sensory motor links, and of course, the massive loss of human life and the corresponding loss of memories and histories. How could one perceive, react, and move in the same way in a city in ruins? In such a context, cinema, according to Deleuze, needed to picture new relationships between time and space and new powers of the body to act in a damaged world. Hence, he asked that cinema provide reasons to believe in the human ability to effect change in this world. He writes, "What is certain is that believing is no longer believing in another world or in a transformed world. It is simply believing in the body." Thus, concrete historical conditions inspire Deleuze's more general reflections on the relationship between cinema and belief, and the philosophical tradition whereby belief is not opposed to knowledge, but is incorporated into it as a form of thought. Although these lofty concerns might seem far removed from the realities of star worship, I contend that by relating belief in Maria Montez among members of the 1960s underground scene to a broader cinematic and philosophical consideration of belief, we might better appreciate the intensity and singularity of their star worship. Moreover, following Moon's argument above, I would argue that their belief in Montez was also directed at restoring a link between their gendered and sexed bodies and a world that seemed unwilling to afford them a place. For Smith and Tavel, reasons to believe were not to be found, however, in the films of Deleuze's European auteurs, Godard or Rossellini, Dreyer or Pasolini, but instead in the exotica of Maria Montez. As Smith puts it in the opening lines of his fascinating essay, The Perfect Filmic Appositeness of Maria Montez, at least in America, a Maria Montez could believe she was the Cobra Woman, the Siren of Atlantis, Scheherazade, etc. She believed, and therefore made the people who went to her movies believe. Those who could believe did. Those who saw the world's worst actress just couldn't, and they missed the magic. Too bad, their loss. And Montez was known at the time as the queen of Technicolor and the world's worst actress. For Smith, viewing Montez films was a practical lesson in belief, available to all, but accessible only to some. In an extended reflection on the importance of Montez for Smith, his friend Ronald Tavel zeroes in on Montez's star quality, this creative action of belief that I would argue is apposite to the star image's mobility within queer counterpublics. So I'm calling her star quality belief, and I'm calling belief a creative action. Tavel writes, impressively, it was this photogenic quality, i.e., her lensable belief, that triggered Smith's ambition in film. Again, precisely, that the woman's belief and exactly what that belief embraced was filmable. What then did it embrace? Tavel asks. A world as fantastical, dazzling, lush, surprising, and crowded with beauty as some children find it to be. And that hers was a central role in that kaleidoscopic daydream. Importantly, this too was filmable. As the princess, she was the princess for whom it all exists, and by whom, i.e., by whose imagination, it all exists. And that this passion, Tavel says Smith contended, this passion, this painterly ecstasy, the Delacroix and Chateaubriandian of her soul, could register on film, could be recorded on film stock. That was what made her a star. So in this long quote, Tavel clarifies that for Smith, belief was an attribute of the visual. It was lensable. One can see Montez's belief. This vision was strong enough so that the kaleidoscopic daydream of an exotic fantasy world around her seemed to emerge as a product of her will alone. Indeed, belief for Smith and Tavel was not simply a psychological state. It's not method acting. It's not method acting with a belief in the true. But it's a creative act, a willful deed, and one perfectly apposite to film. As such, their observations on Montez bear out Edward O'Neill's contention that gay men do not identify with the image of a diva, but with the diva's power and her capacity to organize, structure, and perform that image. Smith and Tavel's Montez worship was therefore a belief in the human ability to produce images that look so beautiful, one wants to scream with joy. Like many other, oh, I forgot a nice image of Mario. I'll leave that here. Okay, like many other Latinas and Latin American performers, foremost among them Brazilian singer and actress Carmen Miranda, but also including Spanish-born but Cuban-raised bandleader Xavier Cugat, Mexican actress Lupe Velez, and the Cuban musician and actor Desi Arnaz. Maria Montez's career was greatly facilitated by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. Roosevelt's foreign policy of non-intervention in Latin American countries, if only on paper, dated back to 1933, but took on greater cultural relevance in the 1940s through an explicit pact between the U.S. government and Hollywood to produce films with Latin American settings, performers, and themes, in the hopes of both winning markets and gaining support in Latin America for the U.S. during the war years. So it's obviously a form of cultural and economic intervention. While this strategy made the flamboyant styles and linguistic innovations of someone like Miranda available and accessible to North American audiences, it also contributed to the production of a kind of Hollywood Orientalism, a generalized exotica of cultural signifiers. Oh, it's time to do something. Okay. Okay, thanks. So I just have maybe 10 more minutes or so. Okay. So while this strategy made the flamboyant styles and linguistic innovations of someone like Miranda available and accessible to North American audiences, it also contributed to the production of a kind of Hollywood Orientalism, a generalized exotica of cultural signifiers from various countries without much concern for the specific cultural and ethnic traditions of any single locality. In an interview that I conducted with Ronald Tavel, he observed that, quote, "In a certain way, these escapist movies would go on to have a second life, beyond the purposes of the good neighbor policy, when they were rediscovered and recycled in the 1960s. Hollywood's Orientalist films were being recycled in fantasies beyond their political intention. They form a private fantasy world for individuals that has a use beyond the colonial purposes. It becomes, for some of us, a personal salvation." End quote. And even before the 1960s, as Tavel and Smith have noted, these escapist, exoticist, and exoticizing films signaled a very particular and expansive kind of fantasy for young gender and sexually deviant children struggling to find a place for their differences in the 1940s and 50s. As Tavel puts it in his inimitable prose, inescapable in this escapism, or, if you will, the unbearability of this, your time and place, is the marriage of the sexual and the exotic. For it is the escape of the secretly sexual other to the other than this. End quote. In the case of Smith, the exotic, as I suggested earlier, was not simply tied to the sexual, but was a gateway for a range of materialistic cultural interventions. Smith was not attempting to escape to the other than this. Rather, he staged an investigation of the other than this in the here and now, merely by attempting to channel Montez and Montezland for their transformative potential in amending a number of locally specific issues, from interior design to urban planning, from gender performance to rent control. This is how Smith's tropicalism functions, as documented by Juan Suarez. And it also bears out José Muñoz's claim about Smith's Montez worship, namely that it helped toxic images expand and become much more than quaint racisms. End quote. Smith didn't expand the images by re-specifying them, but by situating them in relation to other very specific social and political concerns, however obtuse these concerns were addressed in Smith's work. Moreover, Smith's Latina-inspired exotica occurred at a time of increased Latinization and Caribbeanization in New York, in the aftermath of years of post-war, Cold War interventionism in Latin America that resulted in many refugees fleeing to the north. Hence, the underground's Hispanophilia, to quote Suarez once again, may be understood as a queer attempt to align sexual with cultural, social, and ethnic otherness, and to bring it all together in a common form and common front of dissent. Smith's Montez worship manifested itself in the exotic aesthetic of his films, photography, collages, and performances, in the titles of his various works, which recall Montez's film Siren of Atlantis, including his early performance piece from 1965, Rehearsal for the Destruction of Atlantis, as well as An Average Afternoon in Atlantis, or Capitalism of Atlantis. It also surfaces in numerous writings, including the two essays directly focusing on Maria Montez, The Perfect Filmic Appositeness of Maria Montez, and the Memoirs of Maria Montez, or Wait for Me at the Bottom of the Pool. In fact, Smith's Montez worship so permeates his work and his worldview that it is nearly impossible to enumerate every manifestation of her presence in it. The extent of Smith's Montez worship and the significance of it for his daily life is perhaps most dramatically indicated by his redesigning his various New York City apartments to reflect the look and feel of her fantasy films. And here you see his loft. These are sort of rare slide images from a performance he did in his loft. As Tavel notes, Montez's ultimate influence on him and his ultimate tribute to her was the rebuilding of Baghdad, Babylonia into his apartments. A city, a world, a wall, a building. His dwelling reconstructions or devotion to architecture consumed years of his life and were of application and seriousness that would appear to have utilized his concerns and obsession with the late lovely more than any other of his many and wonderful outlets, whether film, criticism, collage, sketching, set designing, and building, or performance. Thus, I would say Jack Smith practiced a belief in Hollywood imagery and stardom. He mobilized this belief to forge real change in his environment. In the early 1960s, and I come now to my concluding thoughts about belief. In the early 1960s, when Smith published his Perfect Filmic Appositeness essay, American film critics were arguing for the artistic value of commercial Hollywood films. Foremost among them, Andrew Sarris, for instance, located a Hollywood auteur's signature in the coherence and wholeness of his, and for Sarris the auteur was decidedly male, style and technique. For Smith, on the other hand, the mark of a film's personality had little to do with coherence of either film style or acting technique. On the contrary, he felt that good technique was something one hid behind in order to avoid self-exposure. Or, as he succinctly put it in an article on the director Josef von Sternberg, most famous for his films with Marlene Dietrich. Good technique being used as something people hide behind when they are frightened by something they wouldn't like in themselves, therefore is in themselves. For Smith, then, good technique functions somewhat like that other structure of fear and deception, commonly known as the closet. It is merely a way of following the rules and abiding by established conventions or accepted criteria. Such a skill is a means of self-deception, a display of non-belief, and certainly not a means of distinguishing one's personality. Smith also had little interest in acting technique so as to produce a coherent character. He writes, "Stars who believe nothing are believable in a variety of roles. Not to me, though, who has abandoned myself to personal tweakiness." Tweakiness is something like idiosyncrasy. Belief, therefore, has to do with embracing and reaffirming one's embodied difference, one's personal tweakiness, which does not allow itself to be conventionalized or normalized as a technique. Indeed, Smith describes good acting technique as good perfs. He says, "The most inevitable execution of the conventional pattern of acting, good perfs. Therefore, you can have good perfs and no real belief. Good perfs that give you no magic. Oh, I guess a sort of magic, a magic of sustained, efficient operation, like the wonder the car motor held out so well after a long trip." What Smith praised instead of the good, then, was not the bad, but the interesting, and hence the human. So here I'm arguing against Sontag, what most people take from Sontag, that Camp is so bad it's good. If we follow Smith, that doesn't hold at all, that idea. As Tavel notes, when I pressed him one night about what a star is, he said it's someone who is always interesting on screen. About Maria Montez's films, Smith writes, "Results of this sort of thing transcend film technique, not barely, but resoundingly, meaningfully, with magnificence, with the vigor that one exposed human being always has, and with failure." And he continues, "I could explain their interest for me, but I can't turn them into good film technique." So for Smith, Montez was not a failure because she was a bad actress. Quite to the contrary, Montez's acting abilities, or lack thereof, were simply not what was of interest on the screen. As he put it succinctly, what she's doing is what acting is substituting for. What interested Smith then were those moments when Montez's assumption of her role seemed motivated by the strength of her belief in the fantasy figures she embodied and in the papier-mâché sets of the fantasy world of her films. When her movements, that is, her facial expressions and gestures, exposed the complexity of that belief in fantasy as a belief in her own beauty, her own distinctiveness, her own fabulousness. In the belief that motivated the fantastic excesses of Montez's films, Smith saw the heterogeneous signs of the complexity of human desire and fantasy. Heterogeneous and possibly incoherent signs suggesting that there are different kinds of people and desires to be found in one's world. Believing Montez meant believing in the possibility of thinking differently, not only about performance and image making, but also about the world one lives in and the worlds one could live in. By emphasizing belief as the defining characteristic in the underground's relationship to Hollywood, I hope to modify discussions that situate these practices of star worship within what Moon calls the extremely reductive rubric of camp. viewing the queer underground's Montez worship as camp tends to reduce its re-evaluation of popular culture to practices of irony and disavowal. I say disavowal because we disavow. It's as if we don't really like what's going on. We only like it because, or we disavow our like of something in order to identify with someone else who says it's bad. And I think that this perspective on camp is problematic. As such, these cultural practices, when one follows this idea of irony and disavowal, these cultural practices take on general relevance as further, and in the case of Warhol, seminal examples of postmodern appropriation and image circulation. So I'm arguing against taking these out of the context they're in and letting them stand for postmodern appropriation. By taking Smith and Tavel at their word, however, by, if you will, believing their contentions about Montez's lensible belief, I hope to highlight their investment in a different, more clandestine mode of image circulation, opposite to their interest in what Smith terms secret flicks, namely that associated with gossip. Muchas gracias. Thank you.